Chapter 8. From somewhere at the bottom of a passage, the smell of roasting coffee, real coffee, not victory, coffee came floating out into the street. Winston paused involuntarily for perhaps 2 seconds. He was back in the half-forgotten world of his childhood. Then a door banged, seeming to cut off the smell as abruptly as though it had been a sound he had walked several kilometers over pavements, and his varicose ulcer was throbbing. This was the second time in 3 weeks that he had missed an evening at the community center, a rash act. Since you could be certain that the number of your attendances at the center was carefully checked in principle, a party member had no spare time and was never alone except in bed. It was assumed that when he was not working, eating, or sleeping, he would be taking part in some kind of communal recreation. To do anything that suggested a taste for solitude, even to go for a walk by yourself, was always slightly dangerous. There was a word for it in Newspeak. Own life it was called, meaning individualism and eccentricity. But this evening, as he came out of the ministry, the balminess of the April air had tempted him. The sky was warmer blue than he had seen it that year, and suddenly the long, noisy evening at the center, the boring, exhausting games, the lectures, the creaking camaraderie oiled by gin had seemed intolerable. On impulse, he had turned away from the bus stop and wandered off into the labyrinth of London, first south, then east, then north again, losing himself among unknown streets and hardly bothering in which direction he was going. If there is hope, he had written in the diary. It lies in the prose. The words kept coming back to him, statement of a mystical truth and a palpable absurdity. He was somewhere in the vague brown-colored slums to the north and east of what had once been St. Pancras Station. He was walking up a cobbled street of little 2-story houses with battered doorways which gave straight on to the pavement and which were somehow curiously suggestive of rat holes. There were puddles of filthy water here and there among the cobbles, in and out of the dark doorways. And down narrow alleyways that branched off on either side, people swarmed in astonishing numbers. Girls in full bloom with crudely lipstick mouths, and youths who chased the girls, and swollen waddling women who showed you what the girls would be like in 10 years' time. And old bent creatures shuffling along on splayed feet, and ragged barefooted children who played in the puddles and then scattered at angry yells from their mothers. Perhaps a quarter of the windows in the street were broken and boarded up. Most of the people paid no attention to Winston. A few eyed him with a sort of guarded curiosity. Two monstrous women with brick red forearms folded across their aprons were talking outside a doorway. Winston caught scraps of conversation as he approached. Yes, I says to her, that's all very well, I says, but if you'd have been in my place, you'd have done the same as what I done. It's easy to criticize, I says, but you ain't got the same problems as what I got. Ah, said the other, that's just it, that's just where it is. The strident voices stopped abruptly. The women studied him in hostile silence as he went past, but it was not hostility. Exactly, merely a kind of wariness, a momentary stiffening as at the passing of some unfamiliar animal. The blue overalls of the party could not be a common sight in a street like this. Indeed, it was unwise to be seen in such places unless you had definite business there. The patrols might stop you if you happened to run into them. May I see your papers? Comrade, what are you doing here? What time did you leave work? Is this your usual way home? And so on and so forth. Not that there was any rule against walking home by an unusual route, but it was enough to draw attention. To you if the thought police heard about it. Suddenly the whole street was in commotion. There were yells of warning from all sides. People were shooting into the doorways like rabbits. A young woman leapt out of a doorway a little ahead of Winston, grabbed up a tiny child playing in a puddle, whipped her apron round it, and leapt back again, all in one movement. At the same instant, a man in a concertina like black suit who had emerged from a side alley ran towards Winston, pointing excitedly to the sky steamer. He yelled, "Look out, Governor!" Bang! Over Ed lay down quick. Steamer was a nickname which, for some reason, the proles applied to rocket bombs. Winston promptly flung himself on his face. The proles were nearly always right when they gave you a warning of this kind. They seemed to possess some kind of instinct which told them several seconds in advance when a rocket was coming. Although the rockets supposedly traveled faster than sound, Winston clasped his forearms above his head. There was a roar that seemed to make the pavement heave. A shower of light objects pattered onto his back when he stood. Woo-hoo-hoo! Up he found that he was covered with fragments of glass from the nearest window. He walked on the bomb had demolished a group of houses 200 meters up the street. A black plume of smoke hung in the sky, and below it a cloud of plaster dust, in which a crowd was already forming round the ruins. There was a little pile of plaster on the pavement ahead of him, and in the middle of it he could see a bright red streak. When he got up to it, he saw that it was a human hand severed at the wrist. Apart from the bloody stump, the hand was so completely widened as to resemble a plaster cast. He kicked the thing into the gutter, and then, to avoid the crowd, he turned down a side street to the right. Within 3 or 4 minutes he was out the area which the bomb had affected, and the sordid swarming life of the streets was going on as though nothing had happened. It was nearly 20 hours, and the drinking shops which the pros frequented, pubs they called them, were choked with customers from their grimy swing doors endlessly opening and shutting. There came forth a smell of urine, sawdust, and sour beer in an angle formed by a projecting house front. 3 men were standing very close together. The middle one of them holding a folded up newspaper, which the other 2 were studying over his shoulders. Even before he was near enough to make out the expression on their faces, Winston could see absorption in every line of their bodies. It was obviously some serious piece of news that they were reading. He was a few paces away from them when suddenly the group broke up, and 2 of the men were in violent altercation. For a moment they seemed almost on the point of blows. Can't you? Bleeding? Well, listen. To what I say I tell you, no number ending in 7 ain't one for over 14 months. Yes, it as then, no, it as not back home. I got the back, I got the ole lot of 'em for over 2 years wrote down on a piece of paper. I takes 'em down reg'lar as the clock, and I tell you, no number ending in 7, yes, a 7. As one, I could pretty near tell you the bleeding number. 407, it ended in. It were in February, 2nd week in February, your grandmother, I got it all down in black and white, and I tell you no number, pack it in. I did lose my voice last night after like 3 hours, said the 3rd man. They were talking about the lottery. Winston looked back when he had gone 30 meters. They were still arguing with vivid, passionate faces. The lottery, with its weekly payout of enormous prizes, was the one public event to which the proles paid serious attention. It was probable that there were some millions of proles for whom the lottery was the principal, if not the only reason for remaining alive. It was their delight, their folly, their anodyne, their intellectual stimulant where the lottery was concerned. Even people who could barely read and write seemed capable of intricate calculations and staggering feats of memory. There was a whole tribe of men who made a living simply by selling systems, forecasts, and lucky amulets. Winston had nothing to do with the running of the lottery, which was managed by the Ministry of Plenty, but he was aware, indeed everyone in the party was aware, that the prizes were largely imaginary. Only small sums were actually paid out, the winners of the big prizes being big prizes being non-existent persons. In the absence of any real intercommunication between one part of Oceania and another, this was not difficult to arrange, but if there was hope, it lay in the pearls. You had to cling on to that. When you put it in words, it sounded reasonable. It was when you looked at the human beings passing you on the pavement that it became an act of faith. The street into which he had turned ran downhill. He had a feeling that he had been in this neighborhood before, and that there was a main thoroughfare not far. Away from somewhere ahead there came a din of shouting voices. The street turned a sharp turn and then ended in a flight of steps which led down into a sunken alley where a few stall keepers were selling tired-looking vegetables. At this moment Winston remembered where he was. The alley led out into the main street and down the next turning. Not 5 minutes away was the junk shop where he had bought the blank book which was now his diary, and in a small stationer's shop not far away he had bought his pen holder and his bottle of ink. He paused for a moment. At the top of the steps on the opposite side of the alley there was a dingy little pub whose windows appeared to be frosted over, but in reality they were merely coated with dust. A very old man, bent but active, with white mustaches that bristled forward like those of a prawn, pushed open the swing door and went in. As Winston stood watching, it occurred to him that the old man, who must be 80 at the least, had already been middle-aged when the revolution happened. He and a few others like him were the last links that now existed with the vanished world of capitalism. In the party itself, there were not many people left whose ideas had been formed before the revolution. The older generation had mostly been wiped out in the great purges of the 50s and 60s, and the few who survived had long ago been terrified into complete intellectual surrender. If there was anyone still alive who could give you a truthful account of conditions in the early part of the century, it could only be April. Suddenly the passage from the history book that he had copied into his diary came back into Winston's mind, and a lunatic impulse took hold of him. He would go into the pub, he would scrape acquaintance with that old man and question him. He would say to him, "Tell me about your life when you were a boy. What was it like in those days? Were things better than they are, or were they worse?" Hurriedly, lest he should have time to become frightened, he descended the steps and crossed the narrow street. It was madness, of course, as usual. There was no definite rule against talking to proles and frequenting there. Frequenting their pubs, but it was far too unusual an action to pass unnoticed. If the patrols appeared, he might plead an attack of faintness, but it was not likely that they would believe him. He pushed open the door, and a hideous cheesy smell of sour beer hit him in the face as he entered. The din of voices dropped to about half its volume. Behind his back he could feel everyone eyeing his blue overalls. A game of darts which was going on at the other end of the room interrupted it. For perhaps as much as 30 seconds, the old man whom he had followed was standing at the bar having some kind of altercation with the barman, a large, stout, hook-nosed young man with enormous forearms. A knot of others standing round with glasses in their hands were watching the scene. "I asked you civil enough, didn't I?" said the old man, straightening his shoulders pugnaciously. "You telling me you ain't got a pint mug in the old bleedin' boozer? And what's in L's name is a pint?" said the barman, leaning forward with the tips of his fingers on the counter. "Our cat 'im calls it." "Calls hisself a barman and don't know what that a pint is. Why, a pint's the half of a quart, and there's 4 quarts to the gallon. Have to teach you the A, B, C next. Never heard of 'em," said the barman shortly. "Liter and half liter, that's all we serve. There's the glasses on the shelf in front of you. I likes a pint," persisted the old man. "You could have drawed me off a pint easy enough. We didn't have these bleedin' liters when I was a young man. When you were a young man, we were all living in the treetops," said the barman, with a glance at the other customers. There was a shout of laughter, and the uneasiness caused by Winston's entry seemed to disappear. The old man's white stubbled face had flushed pink, he turned away, muttering to himself, and bumped into Winston. Winston caught him gently by the arm. "May I offer you a drink?" he said. "You're a gent," said the other, straightening his shoulders again. He appeared not to have noticed Winston's blue overalls. "Pint," he added aggressively to the barman. "Pint of wallop." The barman swished 2 half-liters of dark brown beer in 2 thick glasses, which he had rinsed in a bucket under the counter. Beer was the only drink you could get in prole pubs. The proles were supposed not to drink gin, though in practice they could get hold of it easily enough. The game of darts was in full swing again, and the knot of men at the bar had begun, talking about lottery tickets. Winston's presence was forgotten for a moment. There was a deal table under the window where he and the old man could talk without fear of being overheard. It was horribly dangerous, but at any rate there was no telescreen in the room, a point he had made sure of as soon as he came in. "He could drop me off a pint," grumbled the old man as he settled down behind his glass. "A half-liter ain't enough, it don't satisfy, and a 'ole liter's too much. It starts my bladder running, let alone the price. You must have seen great changes since you were a young man," said Winston tentatively. The old man's pale blue eyes moved from the darts board to the bar, and from the bar to the door of the gents, as though it were in the bar room that he expected the changes to have occurred. "The beer was better," he said finally. "And cheaper. When I was a young man, mild beer wallop we used to call it was 4 pence a pint. That was before the war, of course." "Which war was that?" said Winston. "It's all war," said the old man vaguely. He took up his glass and his shoulders straightened again. "Here's wishing you the very best of health." In his lean throat the sharp-pointed Adam's apple made a surprisingly rapid up and down movement, and the beer vanished. Winston went to the bar and came back with 2 more half-liters. The old man appeared to have forgotten his prejudice. Against drinking a full liter. "You are very much older than I am," said Winston. "You must have been a grown man before I was born. You can remember what it was like in the old days before the revolution. People of my age don't really know anything about those times. We can only read about them in books, and what it says in the books may not be true. I should like your opinion on that. The history books say that life before the revolution was completely different from what it is now. There was the most terrible oppression, injustice, poverty worse than. Anything we can imagine. Here in London, the great mass of the people never had enough to eat. From birth to death, half of them hadn't even boots on their feet. They worked 12 hours a day. They left school at 9. They slept 10 in a room. And at the same time, there were a very few people, only a few thousands. The capitalists, they were called, who were rich and powerful. They owned everything that there was to own. They lived in great, gorgeous houses with 30 servants. They rode about in motor cars and 4-horse carriages. They drank champagne. They wore top hats. The old man brightened. The old man brightened. Suddenly, top hats, he said, funny you should mention the same thing come into my head only yesterday. I don't know why. I was just thinking, I ain't seen a top hat in years. Gone right out. They have. The last time I wore one was at my sister-in-law's funeral, and that was, well, I couldn't give you the date, but it must have been 50 year ago. Of course it was only hired for the occasion. You understand it isn't very important about the top hats, said Winston patiently. The point is, these capitalists, they had a few lawyers and priests and so forth who lived on. Them were the lords of the earth. Everything existed for their benefit. You, the ordinary people, the workers, were their slaves. They could do what they liked with you. They could ship you off to Canada like cattle. They could sleep with your daughters if they chose. They could order you to be flogged with something called a cat o' nine tails. You had to take your cap off when you passed them. Every capitalist went about with a gang of lackeys, who the old man brightened again. Lackeys, he said, now there's a word I ain't heard since ever so long. Lackeys, that reg'lar takes me back, that does. My throat is okay for now, but in like an hour it'll probably be a bit worn out. I recollect, donkeys years ago, I used to sometimes go to Hyde Park of a Sunday afternoon to hear the blokes making speeches. Salvation Army, Roman Catholics, Jews, Indians, all sorts there was. And there was one bloke, well, I couldn't give you his name, but a real powerful speaker. He didn't have give it lackeys. He says lackeys of the bourgeoisie, flunkies of the ruling class, parasites. That was another of 'em. And yet Yanasi definitely called him Yanas. Of course he was referring to the Labour Party. Hyenas. You understand, Winston had the feeling that they were talking at cross purposes. What I really wanted to know was this. He said, do you feel that you have more freedom now than you had in those days? Are you treated more like a human being in those days? The rich people, the people at the top, the House of Lords put in, the old man reminiscently, the House of Lords, if you like what I'm asking, were these people able to treat you as an inferior simply because they were rich and you were poor? Is it a fact, for instance, that you had to call them Sir Aunt? Call them sir and take off your cap when you pass them. The old man appeared to think deeply. He drank off about a quarter of his beer before answering. Yes, he said they liked you to touch your cap to 'em. It showed respect like I didn't agree with it myself, but I done it often enough had to, as you might say. And was it usual? I'm only quoting what I've read in history books. Was it usual for these people and their servants to push you off the pavement into the gutter? One of them pushed me once, said the old man. I recollect it as if it was yesterday. It was boat race night, terrible rowdy they used to get on boat race night, and I bumps in to a young bloke on Shaftesbury Avenue, quite the gent. He was dress shirt, top hat, black overcoat. He was kind of zigzagging across the pavement, and I bumps into him accidental, like. He says, why can't you look where you're going? I says, Jew, you think you've bought the bleedin' pavement? He says, I'll twist your bloody head off if you get fresh with me. I says, you're drunk, I'll give you in charge in half a minute. I says, and if you'll believe me, he puts his hand on my chest and gives me a shove. As pretty near sent me under the wheels of a bus. Well, I was young in them days, and I was going to have fetched him one only. A sense of helplessness took hold of Winston. The old man's memory was nothing but a rubbish heap of details. One could question him all day without getting any real information. The party histories might still be true after a fashion. They might even be completely true. He made a last attempt. Perhaps I have not made myself clear. He said, what I'm trying to say is this: you have been alive a very long time. You lived half your life before the revolution. In 1925, for instance, you were already grown up. Would you say from what you can remember that life in 1925 was better than it is now? Or worse, if you could choose, would you prefer to live then or now? The old man looked meditatively at the darts board. He finished up his beer more slowly than before. When he spoke, it was with a tolerant philosophic air, as though the beer had mellowed him. I know what you expect me to say, he said. You expect me to say as I'd sooner be young again. Most people would say they'd sooner be young if You are stum, you got your elephant strength when you're young. When you get to my time of life, you ain't never well. I suffer something wicked from my feet, and my bladder's just terrible. 6 and 7 times a night it has me out of bed on the other, and there's great advantages in being an old man. You ain't got the same worries, no truck with women, and that's a great thing. I ain't 'ad a woman for near on 30 year if you'd credit it, nor wanted to. What's more, Winston sat back against the windowsill. It was no use going on. He was about to buy some more beer when the old man suddenly got up and shuffled rapidly into the stinking urinal at the side of the room. The extra half-liter was already working on him. Winston sat for a minute or two gazing at his empty glass and hardly noticed when his feet carried him out into the street again. Within 20 years at the most, he reflected, the huge and simple question: was life better before the revolution than it is now? Would have ceased once and For all to be answerable, but in effect it was unanswerable even now, since the few scattered survivors from the ancient world were incapable of comparing one age with another. They remembered a million useless things: a quarrel with a workmate, a hunt for a lost bicycle, pump the expression on a long-dead sister's face, the swirls of dust on a windy morning 70 years ago. But all the relevant facts were outside the range of their vision. They were like the ant, which can see the small objects but not the large ones. And when memory failed, and written records were falsified, when that happened, the claim of the party to have improved the conditions of human life had got to be accepted, because there did not exist, and never again could exist, any standard against which it could be tested. At this moment his train of thought stopped abruptly. He halted and looked up. He was in a narrow street with a few dark little shops interspersed among dwelling houses. Immediately above his head there hung 3 discolored metal balls, which looked as if they had once been gilded. He seemed to know the place, of course. He was standing outside the junk shop where he had bought the diary. A twinge of fear went through him. It had been a sufficiently rash act to buy the book in the beginning, and he had sworn never to come near the place again. And yet the instant that he allowed his thoughts to wander, his feet had brought him round here of their own accord. It was precisely against suicidal impulses of this kind that he had hoped to guard himself by opening the diary. At the same time, he noticed that although it was nearly 21 hours the shop was still open, with the feeling that he would be less conspicuous inside than hanging about on the pavement. He stepped through the doorway. If questioned, he could plausibly say that he was trying to buy razor blades. The proprietor had just lighted a hanging oil lamp which gave off an unclean but friendly smell. He was a man of perhaps 60, frail and bowed, with a long benevolent nose and mild eyes distorted by thick spectacles. His hair was almost white, but his eyebrows were bushy and still black. His spectacles, his gently fussy movements, and the fact that he was wearing an aged jacket of black velvet gave him a vague air of intellectuality, as though he had been some kind of literary man or perhaps a musician. His voice was soft, as though faded, and his accent less debased than that of the majority of proles. "I recognized you on the pavement," he said immediately. "You're the gentleman that bought the young lady's keepsake album. That was a beautiful bit of paper that was cream-laid. It used to be called There's Been No Paper Like That made for, oh, I dare to say, 50 years." He peered at Winston over the top of his spectacles. "Is there anything special I can do for you, or did you just want to look round?" "I was passing," said Winston vaguely. "I just looked in. I don't want anything in particular." "It's just as well," said the other, "because I don't suppose I could have satisfied you." He made an apologetic gesture with his soft, palmed hand. "You see how it is, Empty shop, you might say. Between you and me, the antique trade's just about finished. No demand any longer, and no stock either. Furniture, china, glass, it's all been broken up by degrees, and of course the metal stuff's mostly been melted down. I haven't seen a brass candlestick in years." The tiny interior of the shop was in fact uncomfortably full, but there was almost nothing in it of the slightest value. The floor space was very restricted, because all round the walls were stacked innumerable dusty picture frames, and in the window there were trays of nuts and bolts. Worn-out chisels, penknives with broken blades, tarnished watches that did not even pretend to be in going order, and other miscellaneous rubbish. Only a small table in the corner there, a litter of odds and ends, lacquered snuff boxes, agate brooches, and the like, which was looked as though they might include something interesting. As Winston wandered round the table. His eye was caught by a round, smooth thing that gleamed softly in the lamplight, and he picked it up. It was a heavy lump of glass, curved on one side, flat on the other, making all most a hemisphere. There was a peculiar softness, as of rainwater, in both the color and the texture of the glass. At the heart of it, magnified by the curved surface, there was a strange pink convoluted object that recalled a rose or a sea anemone. "What is it?" said Winston, fascinated. "That's coral, that is," said the old man. "It must have come from the Indian Ocean. They used to kind of embed it in the glass. That wasn't made less than 100 years ago, more by the look of it. It's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing." Said Winston. "It is a beautiful thing," said the other appreciatively. "But there's no many that'd say so nowadays." He coughed. "Now if it so happened that you wanted to buy it, that'd cost you $4. I can remember when a thing like that would have fetched £8, and £8 was, well, I can't work it out, but it was a lot of money. But who cares about genuine antiques nowadays? Even the few that's left." Winston immediately paid over the $4 and slid the coveted thing into his pocket. What What appealed to him about it was not so much its beauty as the air it seemed to possess of belonging to an age quite different from the present one. The soft rain-watery glass was not like any glass that he had ever seen. The thing was doubly attractive because of its apparent uselessness, though he could guess that it must have once been intended as a paperweight. It was very heavy in his pocket, but fortunately it did not make much of a bulge. It was a queer thing, even a compromising thing for a party. Member to have in his possession anything old, and for that matter anything beautiful, was always vaguely suspect. The old man had grown noticeably more cheerful after receiving the $4. Winston realized that he would have accepted 3 or even 2. "There's another room upstairs that you might care to take a look at," he said. "There's not much in it, just a few pieces will do with a light if we're going upstairs." He lit another lamp and with bowed back led the way slowly up. The steep and more stairs, and along a tiny passage into a room which did not give on the street but looked out on a cobbled yard and a forest of chimney pots. Winston noticed that the furniture was still arranged as though the room were meant to be lived in. There was a strip of carpet on the floor, a picture or two on the walls, and a deep slatternly chair drawn up to the fire. Place an old-fashioned glass clock with a 12-hour face was ticking away on the mantelpiece under the window, and occupying nearly a quarter of the room was an enormous bed. An enormous bed. With the mattress still on it, we lived here till my wife died, said the old man half apologetically. I'm selling the furniture off by little and little. Now that's a beautiful mahogany bed, or at least it would be if you could get the bugs out of it, but I dare say you'd find it a little bit cumbersome. He was holding the lamp high up so as to illumine the whole room, and in the warm light the place, the warm dim light, the place looked curiously inviting. The thought flitted through Winston's mind that it would probably be quite easy to rent the room. For a few dollars a week, if he dared to take the risk. It was a wild, impossible notion to be abandoned as soon as thought of, but the room had awakened in him a sort of nostalgia, a sort of ancestral memory. It seemed to him that he knew exactly what it felt like to sit in a room like this, in an armchair beside an open fire, with your feet in the fender and a kettle on the hob, utterly alone, utterly secure, with nobody watching you, no voice pursuing you, no sound except the singing of the kettle. Of the kettle, singing of the kettle, in of the kettle. Woo-hoo-hoo! And the friendly ticking of the clock. There's no telescreen. He could not help murmuring, "Ah," said the old man, "I never had one of those things, too expensive, and I never seemed to feel the need for it somehow. Now that's a nice leg table in the corner there, though of course you'd have to put new hinges on it if you wanted to use the flaps. There was a small bookcase in the other corner, and Winston had already gravitated towards it. It contained nothing but rubbish. The hunting down and destruction of books had been done with the same thoroughness in the prole quarters as everywhere else. It was very unlikely that prole quarters, as everywhere else, it was very unlikely that there existed anywhere in Oceania a copy of a book printed earlier than 1960. The old man, still carrying the lamp, was standing in front of a picture in a rosewood frame which hung on the other side of the fireplace opposite the bed. Now, if you happen to be interested in old prints at all, he began delicately. Winston came across to examine the picture. It was a steel engraving of an oval building with oval building with. Oh no, where was I? Scum, scum. With rectangular windows and a small tower in front. There was a railing running round the building, and at the rear end there was what appeared to be a statue. Winston gazed at it for some moments. It seemed vaguely familiar, though he did not remember the statue. The frames fixed to the wall said, "The old man, but I could unscrew it for you, I dare say I know that building," said Winston. Finally, it's a ruin, now it's in the Cameron, have you been watching for 1 hour? It's a ruin now. It's in the middle of the street outside the Palace of Justice. That's right outside the Lockhart's. It was bombed in. Oh, many years ago it was a church at one time. St. Clement's Danes, its name was. He smiled apologetically, as though conscious of saying something slightly ridiculous, and added, "Oranges and lemons, say the bells of St. Clement's." "What's that?" said Winston. "Oh, oranges and lemons, say the bells of St. Clement's. That was a rhyme we had when I was a little boy. How it goes on I don't remember, but I do know it ended." Up, here comes a candle to light you to bed. Here comes a chopper to chop off your head. It was a kind of a dance they held out there, arms for you to pass under when they came to. Here comes a chopper to chop off your head. They brought their arms down and caught you. It was just names of churches. All the London churches were in it, all the principal ones. That is. Winston wondered vaguely to what century the church belonged. It was always difficult to determine the age of a London building, anything large and impressive, if it was reasonably new in appearance. Was automatically claimed as having been built since the Revolution, while anything that was obviously of earlier date was ascribed to some dim period called the Middle Ages. The centuries of capitalism were held to have produced nothing of any value. One could not learn history from architecture any more than one could learn it from books, statues, inscriptions, memorial stones, the names of streets. Anything that might throw light upon the past had been systematically altered. I never knew it had been a church, he said. He said. "There's a lot of them left, really," said the old man, "though they've been put to other uses now." How did that rhyme go? I've got it. Oranges and lemons, say the bells of St. Clement's. You Owe me 3 farthings, say, the bells of St. Martin's. There now, that's as far as I can get a farthing. That was a small copper coin, looked something like a cent. Where was St. Martin's, said Winston. St. Martin's, that's still standing. It's in Victory Square alongside the picture gallery, a building with a kind of a triangular porch and pillars in front and a big flight of steps. Winston knew the place. Well, it was a museum used for propaganda, displays of various kinds, scale models of rocket, bombs and floating fortresses, waxwork tableau, illustrating enemy atrocities, and the like. St. Martin's in the Fields, it used to be called, supplemented the old man, though I don't recollect any fields anywhere in those parts. Winston did not buy the picture. It would have been an even more incongruous possession than the glass paperweight, and impossible to carry home unless it were taken out of its frame. But he lingered for some minutes more, talking to the old man, whose name he discovered was not Weeks, as one might have gathered from the inscription over the shop front, but Charrington. Mr. Charrington, it seemed, was a widower, age 63, and had inhabited this shop for 30 years. Throughout that time he had been intending to alter the name over the window, but had never quite got to the point of doing it. All the while that they were talking, the half-remembered rhyme kept running through Winston's head. Oranges and lemons, say the bells of St. Clements, you owe me 3 farthings, say the bells of St. Martin's. It was curious, but when you said it to yourself, you had the illusion of actually hearing bells, the bells of a lost London that still existed somewhere, or other disguised and forgotten from one ghostly steeple after another. He seemed to hear them pealing forth, yet so far as he could remember, he had never in real life heard church bells ringing. He got away from Mr. Charrington and went down the stairs alone, so as not to let the old man see him reconnoitering. What? Reconnoitering the street. Before stepping out of the door, he had already made up his mind that after a suitable interval, a month, said he would take the risk of visiting the shop again. It was perhaps not more dangerous than shirking an evening at the center. The serious piece of folly had been to come back here in the first place after buying the diary, and without knowing whether the proprietor of the shop could be trusted. However, yes, he thought, again he would come back. He would buy further scraps of beautiful rubbish. He would buy the engraving of St. Clement's Day, take it out of its frame and carry it home, concealed under the jacket of his overalls. He would drag the rest of that poem out of Mr. Charrington's memory. Even the lunatic project of renting the room upstairs flashed momentarily through his mind again. For perhaps 5 seconds, exaltation made him careless, and he stepped out onto the pavement without so much as a preliminary glance through the window. He had even started humming to an improvised tune, Oranges. And lemons, say the bells of St. Clement's, you owe me 3 farthings, say the suddenly his heart seemed to turn to ice and his bowels to water. A figure in blue overalls was coming down the pavement not 10 meters away. It was the girl from the fiction department, the girl with dark hair. The light was failing, but there was no difficulty in recognizing her. She looked him straight in the face, then walked quickly on as though she had not seen him for a few seconds. Winston was too paralyzed to move. Then he turned to the right and walked heavily away, not noticing for the moment that he was going in the wrong direction. At any rate, one question was settled. There was no doubting any longer that the girl was spying on him. She must have followed him here, because it was not credible that by pure chance she should have happened to be walking on the same evening up the same obscure back street, kilometers distant from any quarter where party members lived. It was too great a coincidence. Whether she was really an agent of the thought police or simply an amateur spy actuated by some officiousness hardly mattered. It was enough that she was watching him. Probably she had seen him go into the pub as well. It was an effort to walk. The lump of glass in his pocket banged against his thigh at each step, and he was half-minded to take it out and throw it away. The worst thing was the pain in his belly. For a couple of minutes he had the feeling that he would die if he did not reach a lavatory soon, but there would be no public lavatories in a quarter like this. Then the spasm passed, leaving a dull ache behind. The street was a blind alley. The street was a blind alley. Winston halted, stood for several seconds, wondering vaguely what to do, then turned round and began to retrace his steps. As he turned, it occurred to him that the girl had only passed him 3 minutes ago, and that by running he could probably catch up with her. He could keep on her track till they were in some quiet place, and then smash her skull in with a cobblestone. The piece of glass in his pocket would be heavy enough for the job. But he abandoned the idea immediately, because even the thought of making any physical effort was unbearable. He could not run, he could not strike a blow. Besides, she was young and lusty and would defend herself. He thought also of hurrying to the community center and staying there till the place closed, so as to establish a partial alibi for the evening. But that too was impossible. A deadly lassitude had taken hold of him. All he wanted was to get home quickly, then sit down and be quiet. It was after 22 hours when he got back to the flat. The lights would be switched off at the main. At 23:30 he went in. To the kitchen and swallowed nearly a teacup full of Victory gin. Then he went to the table in the alcove, sat down, and took the diary out of the drawer, but he did not open it at once. But from the telescreen a brassy female voice was squalling a patriotic song. He sat staring at the marbled cover of the book, trying without success to shut the voice out of his consciousness. It was at night that they came for you, always at night. The proper thing was to kill yourself before they got you. Undoubtedly some people. Woo-hoo-hoo! Did so many of the disappearances were actually suicides, but it needed desperate courage to kill yourself in a world where firearms or any quick and certain poison were completely unprocurable. He thought with a kind of astonishment of the biological uselessness of pain and fear, the treachery of the human body, which always freezes into inertia at exactly the moment when a special effort is needed. He might have silenced the dark-haired girl if only he had acted quickly enough, but precisely because of the extremity of his danger, he had lost the power to act. It struck him that in moments of crisis, one is never fighting against an external enemy, but always against one's own body. Even now, in spite of the gin, the dull ache in his belly made consecutive thought impossible, and it is the same he perceived in all seemingly heroic or tragic situations: on the battlefield, in the torture chamber, on a sinking ship. The issues that you are fighting for are always forgotten, because the body swells up until it fills the universe, and even when you are not paralyzed by fright or screaming with pain, life is a moment struggle against hunger or cold or sleeplessness, against a sour stomach or An aching tooth, he opened the diary. It was important to write something down. The woman on the tally screen had started a new song. Her voice seemed to stick into his brain like jagged splinters of glass. He tried to think of O'Brien, for whom or to whom the diary was written, but instead he began thinking of the things that would happen to him after the thought police took him away. It would not matter if they killed you at once. To be killed was what you expected, but before death nobody spoke of such things, but everybody knew of them. There was the routine of confession that had to be gone through, the groveling on the floor and screaming for mercy, the crack of broken bones, the smashed teeth and bloody clots of hair. Why did you have to endure it, since the end was always the same? Why was it not possible to cut a few days or weeks out of your life? Nobody ever escaped detection, and nobody ever failed to confess when once. You had succumbed to thought crime. It was certain that by a given date you would be dead. Why then did that horror which altered nothing have to lie embedded in future time? He tried with a little more success than before to summon up the image of O'Brien. We shall meet in the place where there's no darkness, O'Brien had said to him. He knew what it meant, or thought he knew, the place where there is no darkness, which was the imagined future which one would never see, but which by foreknowledge one could mystically share in, but which the voice from the telly screen nagging at his ears he could not follow. The train of thought further, he put a cigarette in his mouth. Half the tobacco promptly fell out onto his tongue, a bitter dust which was difficult to spit out. Again the face of Big Brother swam into his mind, displacing that of O'Brien, just as he had done a couple days earlier. He slid a coin out of his pocket and looked at it. The face gazed up at him, heavy, calm, protecting. But what kind of smile was hidden beneath the dark mustache like a leaden knell? The words came back at him. War is peace, freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength. Part 2. Let's see how long it is. The next chapter. One more chapter. It was the middle of the morning, and Winston had left his cubicle to go to the lavatory. A solitary figure was coming towards him from the other end of the long, brightly lit corridor. It was the girl with dark hair. 4 days had gone past since the evening when he had run into her outside the junk shop. As she came nearer, he saw that her right arm was in a sling, not noticeable at a distance because it was of the same color as her overalls. Probably she had crushed her hand while swinging round one of the big kaleidoscopes on which the plots of novels were. plots of novels were roughed in. It was a common accident in the fiction department. There were perhaps 4 meters apart when the girl stumbled and fell almost flat on her face. A sharp cry of pain was wrung out of her. She must have fallen right on the injured arm. Winston stopped short. The girl had risen to her knees. Her face had turned a milky yellow color against which her mouth stood out redder than ever. Her eyes were fixed on his with an appealing expression that looked more like fear than pain. A curious emotion stirred in Winston's heart. In front of him was an enemy who was trying to kill him. In front of him also was a human creature in pain and perhaps with a broken bone already. He had instinctively started forward to help her. In the moment when he had seen her fall on the bandaged arm, it had been as though he felt the pain in his own body. Body, you're hurt, he said. It's nothing, my arm. It'll be all right in a second. She spoke as though her heart were fluttering. She had certainly turned very pale. You haven't broken anything? No, I'm all right. It hurt for a moment, that's all. She held out her free hand to him and he helped her up. She had regained some of her color and appeared very much better. It's nothing, she repeated shortly. I only gave my wrist a bit of a bang. Thanks, comrade. And with that she was gone on in the direction in which she had been going, as briskly as though it had really been nothing. The whole incident could not have been taken as much as half a minute. Not to let one's feelings appear in one's face was a habit that had acquired the status of an instinct, and in any case they had been standing straight in front of a telescreen. When the thing happened, nevertheless, it had been very difficult not to betray a momentary surprise, for in the 2 or 3 seconds while he was helping her up, the girl had slipped something into his hand. There was no question that she had done it intentionally. It was something small and flat. As he passed through the lavatory door, he transferred it to his pocket and felt it with the tips of his fingers. It was a scrap of paper folded into a square. While he stood at the urinal, he managed with a little more fingering to get it unfolded. Obviously, there must be a message of some kind written on it. For a moment, he was tempted to take it into one of the water closets and read it at once, but that would be shocking folly, as he well knew. There was no place where you could be more certain that the telescreens were watching continuously. He went back to his cubicle, sat down, threw the fragment of paper casually among the other papers on the desk, put on his spectacles, and hitched the speak right towards him. 5 minutes, he told himself. 5 minutes at the very least. His heart bumped in his breast with frightening loudness. Fortunately, the piece of work he was engaged on was mere routine, the rectification of a long list of figures not needing close attention. Whatever was written on the paper, it must have some kind of political meaning. So far as he could see, there were 2 possibilities. One, much the more likely, was that the girl was an agent of the thought police, just as he had feared. He did not know why the thought police should choose to deliver their messages in such a fashion, but perhaps they had their reasons. They had their reasons. The thing that was written on the paper might be a threat, a summons, an order to commit suicide, a trap of some description. But there was another, wilder possibility that kept raising its head, though he tried vainly to suppress it. This was that the message did not come from the thought police at all, but from some kind of underground organization. Perhaps the Brotherhood existed after all. Perhaps the girl was part of it. No doubt the idea was absurd, but it had sprung into his mind in the very instant of feeling the scrap of paper in. And it was not till a couple of minutes later that the other, more probable explanation had occurred to him. And even now, though his intellect told him that the message probably meant death, still that was not what he believed, and the unreasonable hope persisted, and his heart banged, and it was with difficulty that he kept his voice from trembling as he murmured his figures into the speak right. He rolled up the completed bundle of work and slid it into the pneumatic tube. 8 minutes had gone by. He readjusted his spectacles. On his nose side and drew the next batch of work towards him with the scrap of paper on top of it. He flattened it out. On it was written in a large unformed handwriting, "I love you." For several seconds he was too stunned even to throw the incriminating thing into the memory hole when he did so, although he knew very well the danger of showing too much interest. He could not resist reading it once again, just to make sure that the words were really there for the rest of the morning. It was very difficult to work. What was even worse than having to focus his mind on a series of niggling jobs was the need to conceal his agitation from the telescreen. He felt as though a fire were burning in his belly. Lunch in the hot, crowded, noise-filled canteen was torment. He had hoped to be alone for a little while during the lunch hour, but as bad luck would have it, the imbecile Parsons flopped down beside him, the tang of his sweat almost defeating the tinny smell of stew, and kept up a stream of talk about the preparations for Hate Week. He was particularly enthusiastic about a papier-mâché model of Big Brother's head, 2 meters wide, which was being made for the occasion by his daughter's troop of spies. The irritating thing was that in the racket of voices, Winston could hardly hear what Parsons was saying, and was constantly having to ask for some fatuous remark to be repeated. Just once he caught a glimpse of the girl at a table with 2 other girls at the far end of the room. She appeared not to have seen him, and he did not look in that direction. The afternoon was more bearable. Immediately after lunch there arrived a woo-hoo-hoo delicate, difficult piece of work which would take several hours and necessitated putting everything else aside. It consisted in falsifying a series of production reports of 2 years ago in such a way as to cast discredit on a prominent member of the inner party who was now under a cloud. This was the kind of thing that Winston was good at, and for more than 2 hours he succeeded in shutting the girl out of his mind altogether. Then the memory of her face came back, and with it a raging, intolerable desire to be alone until he could be alone. It was impossible to think this new development out. Tonight was one of his nights at the community center. He wolfed another tasteless meal in the canteen, hurried off to the center, took part in the solemn foolery of a discussion group, played 2 games of table tennis, swallowed several glasses of gin, and sat for half an hour through a lecture entitled Ingsoc in relation to chess. His soul writhed with boredom, but for once he had no impulse to shirk his evening at the center. At the sight of the words I love you, the desire The desire to stay alive had welled up in him, and the taking of minor risks suddenly seemed stupid. It was not till 23 hours when he was home and in bed, in the darkness where you were safe even from the telescreen so long as you kept silent, that he was able to think continuously. It was a physical problem that had to be solved. How get in touch with the girl and arrange a meeting? He did not consider any longer the possibility that she might be laying some kind of trap for him. He knew that it was not so, because of her unmistakable agitation when she handed him the note. Obviously she had been frightened out of her wits, as well she might be, nor did the idea of refusing her advances even cross his mind. Only 5 nights ago he had contemplated smashing her skull in with a cobblestone, but that was of no importance. He thought of her naked, youthful body as he had seen it in his dream. He had imagined her a fool like all the rest of them, her head stuffed with lies and hatred, her belly full of ice. A kind of fever seized him at the thought that he might lose her. The white youthful body might slip away from him. What he feared more than anything else was that she would simply change her mind if he did not get in touch with her quickly. But the physical difficulty of meeting was enormous. It was like trying to make a move at chess when you were already mated. Whichever way you turned, the telescreen faced you. Actually, all the possible ways of communicating with her had occurred to him within 5 minutes of reading the note, but now, with time to think, he went over them one by one as though laying out a row of instruments on a table. Obviously the kind of encounter that had happened this morning could not be repeated. If she had worked in the records department, it might have been comparatively simple, but he had only a very dim idea whereabouts in the building the fiction department lay, and he had no pretext for going there. If he had known where she lived and at what time she left work, he could have contrived to meet her somewhere on her way home, but to try to follow her was not safe because it would mean loitering about outside the ministry, which was bound to be noticed as for sending a letter through the mails. It was out of the question by a routine that was not even secret. All letters were opened in transit. Actually, few people ever wrote letters for the messages that it was occasionally necessary to send. There were printed postcards with long lists of phrases, and you struck out the ones that were inapplicable. In any case, he did not know the girl's name, let alone her address. Finally, he decided that the safest place was the canteen. If he could get her at a table by herself somewhere in the middle of the room, not too near the telescreens, and with a sufficient buzz of conversation all round, if these conditions endured for say 30 seconds, it might be possible to exchange a few words for a week. After this, life was like a restless dream. On the next day she did not appear in the canteen until he was leaving it, the whistle having already blown. Presumably she had been changed onto a later shift they passed each other without a glance on the day after that she was in the canteen at the usual time, but with 3 other girls at immediately under a telescreen. Then for 3 dreadful days she did not appear at all. His whole mind and body seemed to be afflicted with an unbearable sensitivity, a sort of transparency which made every moment, every sound, every contact, every word that he had to speak or listen to an agony. Even in sleep he could not altogether escape from her image. He did not touch the diary during those days, if there was any relief. It was in his work, in which he could sometimes forget about himself for 10 minutes at a stretch. He had absolutely no clue as to what had happened to her. There was no inquiry he could make. She might have been vaporized. She might have committed suicide. She might have been transferred to the other end of Oceania. Worst and likeliest of all, she might simply have changed her mind and decided to avoid him. The next day she reappeared. Her arm was out of the sling, and she had a band of sticking plaster round her waist, her wrist. The relief of seeing her was so great that he could not resist staring directly at her for several seconds. On the following day he very nearly succeeded in speaking to her. When he came into the canteen, she was sitting at a table well out from the wall and was quite alone. It was early and the place was not very full. The queue edged forward till Winston was almost at the counter, then was held up for 2 minutes because someone in front was complaining that he had not received his tablet of saccharin. But the girl was still alone when Winston secured his tray and began to make for her table. He walked casually towards her, his eyes searching for a place at some table beyond her. She was perhaps 3 meters away from him. Another 2 seconds would do it. Then a voice behind him called Smith. He pretended not to hear. Smith repeated the voice more loudly. It was no use. He turned round. A blonde-headed, silly-faced young woman named Wilshire, whom he barely knew, was inviting him with a smile to a vacant place at his table. It was not safe to refuse. After having been recognized, he could not go and sit at a table with I got like 3 pages left, then I'm gonna stop. Unattended girl. It was too noticeable. He sat down with a friendly smile. The silly blonde face beamed into his. Winston had a hallucination of himself smashing a pickaxe right into the middle of it. The girl's table filled up a few minutes later, but she must have seen him coming towards her, and perhaps she would take the hint. Next day he took care to arrive early. Sure enough, she was at a table in about the same place, and again alone. The person immediately ahead of him in the queue was a small swiftly moving beetle, like man with a flat face and tiny suspicious eyes. As Winston turned away from the counter with his tray, he saw that the little man was making straight for the girl's table. His hope sank again. There was a vacant place at a table further away, but something in the little man's appearance suggested that he would be sufficiently attentive to his own comfort to choose the emptiest table with ice at his heart. Winston followed. It was no use unless he could get the girl alone. At this moment there was a tremendous crash. The little man was sprawling on all fours. His tray had gone flying. 2 streams of soup and coffee were flowing across the floor. He started to his feet with a malignant glance at Winston, whom he evidently suspected of having tripped him up, but it was all right. 5 seconds later, with a thundering heart, Winston was sitting at the girl's table. He did not look at her. He unpacked his tray and promptly began eating. It was all important to speak at once before anyone else came, but now a terrible fear had taken possession of him. A week had gone by since she had first approached him. She would have changed her mind. She must have changed her mind. It was impossible that this affair should end successfully. Such things did not happen in real life. He might have flinched altogether from speaking if at this moment he had not seen Ampleforth, the hairy-eared poet, wandering limply round the room with a tray, looking for a place to sit down. In his vague way, Ampleforth was attached to Winston and would certainly sit down at his table if he caught sight of him. There was perhaps a minute in which to act. Both Winston and the girl were eating steadily. The stuff they were eating was a thin stew, actually a soup of haricot beans. In a low murmur, Winston began speaking. Neither of them looked up. Steadily they spooned the watery stuff into their mouths, and between spoonfuls exchanged the few necessary words in low, expressionless voices. What time do you leave work? 18:30. Where can we meet? Victory Square, near the monument. It's full of telescreens. It doesn't matter if there's a crowd. Any signal. No, don't come up to me until you see me among a lot of people. And don't look at me. Just keep somewhere near me. What time? 19 18 hours, all right, Ampleforth failed to see Winston and sat down at another table. They did not speak again, and so far as it was possible for two people sitting on opposite sides of the same table, they did not look at one another. The girl finished her lunch quickly and made off while Winston stayed to smoke a cigarette. Winston was in Victory Square before the appointed time. He wandered round the base of the enormous fluted column at the top of which Big Brother's statue gazed southward towards the skies where he had vanquished thee. Vanquished. Eurasian aeroplanes, the East Asian aeroplanes, it had been a few years ago in the Battle of Airstrip 1. In the street in front of it there was a statue of a man on horseback, which was supposed to represent Oliver Cromwell. At 5 minutes past the hour, the girl had still not appeared again. The terrible fear seized upon Winston. She was not coming. She had changed her mind. He walked slowly up to the north side of the square and got a sort of pale-colored pleasure from identifying St. Martin's Church, whose bells, when it had bells, had chimed, "You owe me 3 farthings. You owe me 3 farthings." Then he saw the girl standing at the base of the monument, reading or pretending to read a poster which ran spirally up the column. It was not safe to go near her until some more people had accumulated. There were telescreens all around the pediment, but at this moment there was a din of shouting and a zoom of heavy vehicles from somewhere to the left. Suddenly everyone seemed to be running across the square. The girl nipped nimbly round the lions at the base of the monument and joined in the rush. Winston followed. As he ran he gathered from some shouted remarks that a convoy of Eurasian prisoners was passing. Already a dense mass of people was blocking the south side of the square. Winston, at normal times the kind of person who gravitates to the outer edge of any kind of scrimmage, shoved-butted, squirmed his way forward into the heart of the crowd. Soon he was within arm's length of the girl, but the way was blocked by an enormous prole and an almost equally enormous woman, presumably his wife, who seemed to form an impenetrable wall of flesh. Flesh. Winston wriggled himself sideways and with a violent lunge managed to drive his shoulder between them. For a moment it felt as though his entrails were being ground to pulp between the two muscular hips. Then he had broken through, sweating a little. He was next to the girl. They were shoulder to shoulder, both staring fixedly in front of them. A long line of trucks with wooden face guards armed with submachine guns standing upright in each corner, was passing slowly down the street in the trucks. Little yellow men in shabby greenish uniforms were squatting jammed close together, their sad Mongolian faces yellow, gazed out over the sides of the trucks utterly incurious. Oh, occasionally when a truck jolted, there was a clank of metal. All the prisoners were wearing leg irons. Truckload after truckload of their sad faces passed. Winston knew they were there, but he saw them only intermittently. The girl's shoulder and her arm right down to the elbow were pressed against his. Her cheek was almost near enough for him to feel its warmth. She had immediately taken charge of the situation, just as she had done in the canteen. She began speaking in the same expressionless voice as before, with lips barely moving, a mere murmur easily drowned by the din of voices and the rumbling of the trucks. Can you hear me? Yes. Can you get Sunday afternoon off? Yes. Then listen carefully. You'll have to remember this. Go to Paddington Station with a sort of military precision that astonished him. She outlined the route that he was to follow. A half-hour railway journey. Turn left outside the station. 2 kilometers along the road. A gate with the top bar missing. A path across the field. A grass-grown lane. A track between bushes. A dead tree with moss on it. It was as though she had a map inside her head. Can you remember all of that? She murmured finally. Yes. You turn left, then right, then left again. And the gate's got no top bar. Yes. What time? About 15. You may have to wait. I'll get there by another way. Are you sure you remember everything? Yes. Then get away from me as quick as you can. She need not have told him that, but for the moment they could not extricate themselves from the crowd. The trucks were still filing past, the people still insatiably gaping at the start. There had been a few boos. And hisses, but it came only from the party members among the crowd, and had soon stopped. The prevailing emotion was simply curiosity. Foreigners, whether from Eurasia or East Asia, were a kind of strange animal. One literally never saw them except in the guise of prisoners. Even as prisoners, one never got more than a momentary glimpse of them. Nor did one know what became of them. Apart from the few who were hanged as war criminals, the others simply vanished, presumably into forced labor camps. The round Mongol faces had given way to faces of a more European type. Dirty, bearded, and exhausted from over scrubby cheekbones. Eyes looked into Winston's, sometimes with strange intensity, and flashed Away again the convoy was drawing to an end. In the last truck he could see an aged man with his face a mass of grizzled hair, standing up right with wrists crossed in front of him as though he were used to having them bound together. It was almost time for Winston and the girl to part, but at the last moment, while the crowd still hemmed them in, her hand felt for his and gave it a fleeting squeeze. Gave it a fleeting squeeze. You're a Puritan. Do you mean a Puritan? What is a Puritan? Oh, like a pirate. I get it. It could not have been 10 seconds, and yet it seemed a long time that their hands were clasped together. He had time to learn every detail of her hand. He explored the long fingers, the shapely nails, the hardened palm with its row of calluses, the smooth flesh under the wrist. Merely from feeling it, he would have known it by sight. In the same instant it occurred to him that he did not know what color the girl's eyes were. They were probably brown, but people with dark hair sometimes had blue eyes. To turn his head and look at her would have been inconceivable folly. With hands locked together, invisible among the press of bodies, they stared steadily in front of them, and instead of the eyes of the girl, the eyes of the aged prisoner gazed mournfully at Winston out of nests of hair. That's the end of that chapter. Let's see how long the next one is. I think I'm gonna stop there and go have some dinner, 'cause I'm hungry. Yum yum. I need to put some food in my tum-tum. Good night. I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you for watching. Goodbye. 1984.